Hello again from San Antonio, Texas. You know, around 1982-1983 time frame, I was assigned to Fort Stewart, Georgia as a sergeant, E5 sergeant with the military police. Fort Stewart's located about 40 miles west of Savannah, Georgia. Fort Stewart's the home to several large mechanized companies, or tank companies if you will, 3rd Infantry Division, as well as the 2nd of the 75th Ranger Battalion. Fort Stewart's the largest army base east of the Mississippi, covering some 280,000 square acres. It's 39 miles long and 19 miles wide, and spreads out across 4 counties in Georgia. Although extremely large, a portion of the base, or a large portion of the base, if you will, is covered by very dense swamp with only tank trails that have been built up crisscrossing it. I was assigned as the assistant NCOIC, or non-commissioned officer in charge, of the K-9 unit. We had 1 bomb-sniffing dog and 6 patrol narcotic detector dog teams. Our K-9 unit was tasked with patrolling the base, assisting the regular MP company and the DoD traffic officers on patrol, conducting vehicle narcotic searches with the dogs, and conducting scheduled and unscheduled barracks inspections or narcotic searches with the dogs upon the request of the company, battalion, or division commander, whichever. The DoD officers were strictly traffic officers. They made no calls except maybe to back up an MP unit if they're in extreme distress. They were made up of older officers, good old Georgia boys actually, that had already retired from local police and sheriff's departments in that area around the base. I was working the B shift, which is 4 p.m. to midnight, with my trusty dog McAdoo, or Mac for short, a very large and angry German shepherd who basically hated all living human beings except me. I had a brand new young pre-FC private with me this night, conducting orientation and field training with our newly arrived recruit. The K-9 unit patrolled using either full-size panel vans with a cage built behind the driver passenger seats, or a full-size pickup truck where the dog rode in the passenger seat. Both were marked with military police emblems and all the normal good stuff, the lights, the sirens, etc., etc. I will never forget the new PFC's name was William Bill Ogden, and he hailed from New York City proper. He was having a bit of trouble adapting to the base, as he had literally never seen so much grass or so many trees in his life, nor was he enjoying the amount of wildlife that roamed the post freely. We had a large variety of animals on the base, from wolves to feral foxes, feral hogs, razorback pigs, not to mention deer, the occasional black bear, panthers, coyotes, and a plethora, I've always wanted to use that word, of smaller creatures. Although I couldn't tell you what day of the month it was, I can tell you that it got a little cold when the sun went down that time of year. It was a very slow weekday evening, and we initially were running radar on the road that leads from the base entrance several miles to the cantonment area, which is the base city, if you will. This area is a long, lonely road, for the most part bordered by swamp on both sides of the road. Everyone on the base uses that road, going to Savannah and back to spend their time off, and would return with either speeding or drunk, or both. We were sitting on the right side shoulder of the road, running radar in the direction of anyone returning to base from the interstate front gate several miles ahead of us. The location was miles from the base entrance and the cantonment area, basically out in the middle of the swamp that surrounded us for miles. Only K-9 units and DoD traffic units, 2-man cars, patrolled this area, as it was quite literally miles from the nearest backup officer. It was already dark, and I had opened both windows of the van to let a cool breeze come through. After a few minutes, I noticed that PFC Ogden was sitting on the edge of his seat, leaning away from the window towards the inside of the vehicle, towards me. In fact, he was leaning in so far that he only had one cheek on the seat. I asked him what was the matter, and he stated that he thought he heard something walking through the swamp outside his window. The poor city boy was terrified. After all, he'd never been outside the concrete jungle in New York City, and now faced with a massive amount of nature in the dark. Now, I will give you the fact that those swamps are a very creepy place, especially after dark. Even for a guy like me who grew up in the country and was normally pretty comfortable with the woods and the darkness. But I always figured that I had a huge German Shepherd and a Colt 45 pistol that I was very good with for protection, I'd probably be all right. PFC Ogden, on the other hand, was imagining all sorts of creatures and things crawling out from the Black Lagoon. Things lurk in the swamp, and the swamp was right there, 6 feet outside of his window in the dark, and his window was open, poor guy. Those of you who are or were police officers know that sometimes it's like being a frat house. We can be pretty cold to our new officers. After counseling the new PFC about the fact that he was a United States Army military police officer and cannot succeed in his career if he's afraid of the dark, we continued running radar for a while, but did not see any vehicles. A short time later, one of the DOD traffic units came up, also a little bored, pulled up to us and started to chat. We both proceeded down the road a bit to a clearing off the roadway so we could pull our cars driver's window to driver's window and talk. It was still pitch black, but at least we were off the main road. A few minutes after that, the other MP sergeant pulled up to talk. The DOD officers, being the local good old boys they were, and cops that they had been forever, were telling stories of the things that live in the swamps. The things that was that these guys told hair-raising stories of encountering things in the swamps on the base and when they were working for their previous agencies. They were very serious, and they were talking and did this with a straight face. By the time PFC Ogden, who had been listening intently to us go to these things, he wanted to go AWOL from the base. At one point, he actually asked me if he could pull out his .45 and hold it on his lap. This caused everyone, of course, to laugh at him. Then we reminded him that we were now 5 of us. We were plus a vicious dog, all with .45s, that he really didn't have anything to worry about. He was still visibly scared. The DOD officers started telling us that there were several old cemeteries in the base, and they may be hundreds of years old. They went on to telling the stories that those places were haunted, and that if you laid down on the gravestone slab markers at night, you can hear the sounds of the dead. As they spoke, speaking so seriously and in a matter-of-fact tone, myself and the other MP sergeant were trying to keep a straight face. PFC Ogden, he was near panic. We asked the DOD cops if they knew any cemeteries in the area of the base where we could go check them out. They agreed, and we all followed them in a kind of procession through the back roads that I didn't even know were there, and then down a bunch of dirt roads. After a few miles, we came upon a very old graveyard in a clearing in the swamp. We parked our vehicles facing the graveyard and let our headlights shine on it. It had an old iron fence around it, and it was obvious that no one had been around there for probably many, many years. We all got out of our vehicles and walked over to the fence to check out the gravestones, the ones that were closest to the front of the cemetery fence at least. All were hand-chiseled grave markers and deteriorated badly with time, and the ones that we saw that we could make out were from the 1700s and 1800s. It was really a very interesting place had it been daylight. You have to picture this scene, though. It was an ancient graveyard surrounded by huge trees covered with hanging Spanish moss on a cold, moonless night. It truly looked like a location that had been plucked straight out of some old horror movie. Here we were, checking the graveyard and trying to get PFC Ogden to lay down on one of the gravestones. Of course, he was having none of that. At some point, it dawned on PFC Ogden that the DOD officers might just be trying to frighten him, of which they were doing a very good job. He came up with the idea to return to his barracks and get his boombox, one of those very large radios. He wanted to place it on record and put it on one of the gravestones and leave, and then come back and see if there were any sounds on the tape. We decided, since it was a slow night, that'd be a simple plan. So I drove PFC Ogden back to his barracks to get his boombox. It was huge, probably 18 inches or more high and 2 feet long or so. He had grabbed a 30-minute cassette tape for it. We drove back out and met with the other officers, and we all proceeded back to the graveyard. We told PFC Ogden that it was his idea that he would have to walk out about halfway through the graveyards and put the boombox on one of the gravestone slabs and then turn it on. Of course, being cops, as he walked into the graveyard, we all turned our headlights off on our vehicles, leaving him there in the dark in the cemetery. He yelled something that I probably shouldn't repeat on this video, and we turned our lights back on. He went about halfway or so through the graveyard and stood for just a moment reading the old gravestone. He put down the boombox and ran back to the van and hopped in. We all drove off back to the main road a couple of miles out. PFC Ogden was white as a sheet when I looked at him. I asked him if he was all right, and I thought he was going to cry. He said the name on the gravestone that he had just happened to put the boombox on was named Ogden. Okay, now none of us obviously had never been to that cemetery before, and certainly did not know that there was an Ogden in that cemetery. For the next 30 minutes or so, we all sat back in the clearing off the main highway and laughed at how stupid we were, 5 grown men, cops no less, putting a recording device on an old gravestone looking for ghosts. After about 45 minutes, we all drove back to the graveyard, and PFC Ogden goes out, picks up his radio from the grave, and comes back to the van. We all drove out to the woods to a little rest area right off the side of the main highway. We all get out and sit around a picnic table listening to the tape. Before I continue, let me explain to you that if you've never lived around a swamp in southern United States, you probably have never heard of tree frogs. They are bright green little frogs about the size of a quarter or so. They live in the trees and in and around the swamp, and at night they make a very high-pitched and loud sound for such a little frog. Now multiply that sound by literally billions of these frogs surrounding us, and you kind of understand what it was like being near the swamp at night. The sound is deafening. It's difficult to talk anyone without raising your voice, even when you're standing right next to them. Remember, we all sat and listened to this silly tape, outside on this picnic table. The sounds of the tree frogs all around us were deafening. This boombox was very good, though. First, you can actually hear PFC Ogden's footsteps in the grass as he walks away from the grave after turning on his tape recorder. Then you hear our vehicles in the distance drive away from the graveyard and disappear. About halfway through the tape, you hear a fluttering noise, a bird landing somewhere close to the grave. Shortly thereafter, you hear the call of a bobwhite, a quail basically, a couple of times, and the bird is heard then to flutter away. The tape is nearly over, and we're all talking and laughing about the fact we all heard the quail when on the last few seconds of the tape comes a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. It was 2 very loud moans, one right after the other. Then the tape finishes and cuts off. It was, oh, oh, and then the tape cuts off. Okay. A cold chill ran up my spine, and in an instant, all of us talking and laughter ceased. Not believing what we had heard, we rewound the tape a short way and replayed the tape. Again, we heard the 2 loud moans, as if someone with a low voice was in agony and right near the boombox itself. We all jumped out from the picnic table, piled into our respective police cars, and tore out of there and headed for the PMO, which is the military police headquarters. When we got back to the station, we woke the duty officer, a military police lieutenant, and started to play the tape for him. Only this time, since we were playing the tape in the office, there were no tree frogs making noise, we heard more than we had heard the first time we'd listened to it. A few minutes after the bird flies away, you start hearing distinctly someone breathing very heavily, very slowly, and very low. This continues for the rest of the tape. We had not heard it when we listened out in the swamps because the sound of the tree frogs were drowning out the sound of the tape. The lieutenant that night and everyone else PFC Ogden showed the tape to were all really freaked out by this recording. The cemetery was miles from people, and even if someone had been out there for some unknown reason, the recorder was more than sensitive enough to hear them coming and going from the radio where the radio was sitting. I don't mind telling you this incident scared me to the core and changed the way I believe in the supernatural for the rest of my life. A few days later, I dropped by PFC Ogden's barracks to borrow the tape to make a copy of it for myself. He told me he had been so afraid to have it in his room with the voice on it that he taped over it the next day. I'm not sure at the time he had actually taped over it, but shortly thereafter, I moved on to my next duty station, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. That happened over 40 years ago, and over the years I've often thought about trying to find PFC William Bell Ogden, and I came to my senses and realized the chance of finding him in New York City area was probably 0 or less. I have no explanation as to what happened that night or what that was we all heard on the tape. I can tell you it was real, and there's no chance it was a hoax. The DoD officers that told us about it were not surprised that it happened to us. They were surprised that we actually got it on tape and recorded it. Did we actually hear the voices of the spirit that was buried there? Does that tape still exist somewhere? I don't know. Where is Bill Ogden now? I don't know that either. But at least we have a good story we can relate to you.